Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. 911, what's your emergency? I think someone just shot the girl behind the bar. I don't hear anything now. The place is too quiet. It was supposed to be a slow Sunday morning in Berlin, New Hampshire. But within 3 minutes of that call, a local restaurant had become a double crime scene. And what followed would raise questions that echoed far beyond its walls. At 9:45 a.m. on June 23, 2025, Berlin Police Department officers arrived at La Casita, a Mexican restaurant located at 4 Hillside Avenue. They entered through the unlocked front door. No signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no witnesses remaining inside the premises. What they found, however, required immediate containment and escalation. The victim, later identified as 25-year-old Sandra Marisol Fuentes Huaracha, was found deceased behind the service bar. Her position indicated she had collapsed backward onto the floor, with visible trauma to the upper torso and face consistent with a close-range discharge from a shotgun. She was unresponsive, and there were no signs of life at the scene. Roughly 25 feet away, in the restroom adjoining the hallway near the kitchen, a second adult was discovered. Male, approximately mid-40s to early 50s, a shotgun lying beside the body. A single self-inflicted wound to the head. The scene was quiet, sterile, and complete. Nothing more to interrupt, nothing more to save. La Casita was immediately cordoned off as a dual-scene homicide investigation. EMS declared both victims dead on arrival. The restaurant's surveillance system was functional, and the footage from the past 48 hours was secured for analysis. Initial notes from officers on scene mentioned the peculiar order of details: the calm layout of the interior, 2 phones found on site, one belonging to the female victim near the POS terminal and one inside the male's pocket, and a plastic container of tamales still warm on the countertop, suggesting the place had opened for prep only minutes before the attack. No one had seen the shooter enter. No one saw him leave. By 10:30 a.m., the New Hampshire Department of Justice had dispatched members of the Attorney General's office to oversee what appeared to be a domestic-related murder-suicide. But that terminology wouldn't appear in any official communication for another 48 hours. Not until the facts supported the sequence. Not until the coroner completed the preliminary forensic sweep. The female victim was identified through both state-issued ID and biometric match as Sandra Fuentes, a U.S. citizen of Peruvian descent, known locally as an employee and part-time event organizer. She had been working at La Casita for 3 years and was considered a popular figure in the Berlin Latinx community. Local residents described Sandra as bright, motivated, and deeply engaged in neighborhood affairs. A recent photo from the town's Cinco de Mayo event, posted by the city council's official page, showed her smiling in a flower crown, handing out flyers. She was not known to be involved in any criminal activity, but within the past year, several friends say she had become a little more withdrawn, nervous sometimes when her phone buzzed, and insistent about locking the front entrance, even during prep hours. None of that had been reported to law enforcement, not in a way that left a permanent record at least. But that would change quickly once her digital footprint was reviewed. As crime scene investigators processed the interior of the restaurant, an initial set of forensic priorities was established. Ballistic origin, determine trajectory and range of the fatal shots. Digital device access, extract messaging and call data from both recovered phones. Surveillance review, secure the restaurant's internal footage for activity in the 48 hours prior to the incident. Victimology assessment, review all prior known contacts, domestic complaints, or threats made toward the deceased. At 1:10 p.m., the male victim was tentatively identified as Michael James Gleason Jr., age 50, of Milan, NH, a former maintenance worker with no active employment records since early 2024. Gleason had previously been connected to Sandra Fuentes through a cohabitation address on municipal documents from 2023. That address had since been removed, and further checks revealed a restraining order filed by Sandra against Gleason in April 2025. That order, obtained through Coas County Family Court, cited specific allegations: unlawful confinement, sexual coercion, and misappropriation of funds. Court records confirmed that Gleason had posted a $5,000 cash bond and had been released pending further adjudication. No GPS ankle monitor was assigned. No weapons check had been logged at the time of release. One officer remarked in his body cam transcript, "We're looking at a case that might have had paperwork, but not enough guardrails." The autopsy of Sandra Fuentes would be scheduled for June 24th, with expected priority in state forensic labs due to the public attention surrounding the case. Cause of death was preliminarily labeled as homicide by firearm trauma, likely 12-gauge, pending confirmation. An early review of surveillance footage by tech specialists later revealed, at 9:31 a.m., a man matching Gleason's profile was seen parking a silver pickup outside the rear alley. At 9:36, he entered the restaurant through the front door. No others followed. At 9:44:07, the audio recorded a distinct blast. A pause, then a second one. Then silence. The system timestamp was intact. There had been no evidence of footage deletion or tampering. This wasn't a crime concealed. It was one carried out in real time with no attempt to flee. For the residents of Berlin, the shock was immediate. There were no protests, no loud media vans outside. Just a sudden stillness in a town that had not seen a domestic-related homicide in over a decade. As one detective quietly noted during the evidence review, "He didn't come here to argue. He came to finish something." Sandra Marisol Fuentes Huaracha wasn't supposed to be on any crime scene report. Her name wasn't listed in any gang database. Her fingerprints weren't in CODIS, and no law enforcement agency in the Northeast had flagged her for anything outside a speeding ticket issued in 2022. She lived quietly, worked 6 days a week, and rarely traveled outside Coos County. But forensic investigations aren't built on surface impressions. On June 24, 2025, just one day after her body was recovered from the floor of La Casita, investigators from the Attorney General's office launched a full-scale victimology profile. The intent was simple: determine how a 25-year-old woman with no known enemies ended up shot dead in her place of employment. The first set of evidence came from Sandra's personal cell phone. Retrieved from behind the restaurant's counter, her iPhone 12 mini was undamaged and unlocked. No biometric access had been disabled. A preliminary digital triage was performed using Celebrite UFED, isolating message threads, contact history, and deleted correspondence. Between May 15th and June 20th, Sandra had received 27 text messages from a contact saved under a non-identifiable name, M. The last text from that number, sent at 2:13 a.m. on June 23rd, read, "I'm not leaving town until you talk to me face-to-face." Investigators flagged the tone as coercive. There had been no reply from Sandra's device. Her last outgoing message, sent at 7:48 p.m. on June 22nd, was to a coworker named Alondra G., confirming she would open the restaurant early Sunday morning. That plan aligned with the presence of fresh prep materials found on site: dough, thawing meat, and a partially open produce delivery logged by a supplier at 8:51 a.m. Alondra later told investigators, "She didn't like opening alone, but she said she wanted to get it over with. Said Sundays were the quietest. I didn't think anything of it." The second layer of inquiry came from Sandra's digital calendar. While it had no direct mentions of threats, a private note on June 10th read, "Court again next month. Don't let guard down. He's watching." That entry led authorities to dig into court records more deeply. What surfaced wasn't a single incident, but a string of domestic allegations going back nearly a year, all tied to the same individual, a man Sandra had once listed as her emergency contact, cohabitant, and business advisor during her failed attempt to open a food truck in late 2023. Public records showed she had filed for a restraining order in April 2025, citing psychological manipulation, surveillance, and one confirmed physical assault. The documentation also included Sandra's handwritten statement alleging that the subject had taken $2,400 from her private account without consent and held her inside his car for nearly 45 minutes after an argument, refusing to unlock the doors. A court-approved protective order had been granted on April 19th, with the defendant ordered to stay at least 500 feet away from Sandra's home and workplace. There was no GPS monitoring included in the order, no mandatory mental health evaluation. The defendant posted bond and remained in the area. When asked why she didn't relocate, one friend noted, She didn't want to leave. She said she built her life here. She just wanted to be left alone. The third forensic vector arrived from social data extraction. A background sweep of Sandra's online presence found several public-facing posts in early 2024 showing her engaged in community events. Ribbon cuttings, local art walks, holiday festivals. But by fall of the same year, activity dropped by over 80%. Photos became less frequent, comments sparse. Her Instagram account was set to private in December 2024. Sandra's sister, Lucia, provided context in a formal statement. She became guarded. She was afraid of being seen too much. Even the restaurant. She used the back entrance for a while. All signs pointed to a victim who had attempted to enforce boundaries, documented her fears through both legal and private means, and yet remained vulnerable in a setting she considered familiar and safe. Forensic analysts working the psychological profile noted a pattern known as pre-incident compression, a common timeline seen in cases of escalating domestic threat, in which a victim shrinks their routines, limits contact, and relies on routines perceived as low risk. Unfortunately, this often leads to predictable exposure points, such as a solo shift on a quiet Sunday morning. The autopsy, completed on June 24th by the New Hampshire Medical Examiner's Office, confirmed the cause of death as multiple penetrating injuries consistent with 12-gauge shotgun discharge at close range. The patterning of soot and stippling around the wounds confirmed that the barrel had been fired from a distance of less than 3 feet. No defensive injuries were present, no signs of physical altercation. She had not run. She had not screamed. She had not made it past the service area. That absence of struggle would later inform prosecutors' analysis. This wasn't a confrontation. It was an execution. By the close of June 24th, the forensic timeline had established 3 critical points. Sandra Fuentes was inside La Casita alone by 9:20 a.m. Her device showed no outgoing communications between 9 a.m. and time of death. The gunshot audio was captured at 9:44:07 and again at 9:44:51. The second shot was confirmed to be self-inflicted by the male suspect. Investigators stopped short of confirming motive publicly, but the working theory took shape internally. Sandra Fuentes was the target of a premeditated attack by someone who knew her schedule, her vulnerabilities, and her precise location that morning. What investigators didn't yet know, and what Chapter 3 will uncover, was how the attacker bypassed both public suspicion and police scrutiny to carry out a planned assault in broad daylight, undetected until after it was too late. Because in towns like Berlin, New Hampshire, where most people don't lock their doors until sundown, familiarity can be its own kind of risk. Sandra Fuentes was not invisible to the system. She had filed a formal complaint, stood before a judge, and asked the courts for protection. On April 17, 2025, in a courtroom in Coast County, she described her fear under oath. The man she spoke about was known to the clerk by name. Yet by the end of that hearing, he walked out on his own terms. The subject of that protective order was Michael James Gleason, Jr., 50 years old, lifelong resident of northern New Hampshire. His record at the time was not blank, but it lacked what law enforcement typically categorizes as disqualifying violence: a 2003 trespassing charge, a 2011 DUI, a minor assault complaint in 2015 that was dismissed for lack of evidence. No felonies, no weapons prohibitions. But what Sandra submitted to the court on April 17th was different. Her affidavit included allegations of psychological control, digital surveillance, coercive sex, and financial theft. She described a pattern of behavior consistent with intimate terrorism, a term increasingly used in criminal justice circles to refer to sustained patterns of control, not just isolated outbursts. Her statement included specific dates. March 21st, followed in her car. March 29th, forcibly locked inside his home. April 4, threats made over text, followed by unexpected appearance at her job. She provided screenshots, voice messages, and written testimony. The judge granted a temporary protective order, valid for 30 days, pending a formal hearing. By the time of that second hearing on April 19th, Gleason had hired legal counsel. He denied the allegations and claimed Sandra had exaggerated their disputes to gain leverage in an ongoing property disagreement. The court granted a final protective order, valid for 1 year, with no contact permitted, and issued a written warning against stalking or physical approach. However, the order did not include mandatory GPS tracking, nor did it require Gleason to surrender any firearms. Under New Hampshire law, unless a firearm had been used in the complaint, judges were not obligated to enforce weapons forfeiture. On April 22nd, Gleason posted $5,000 bail in an unrelated criminal case stemming from Sandra's accusations of unlawful confinement and financial fraud. He returned to Berlin, his driver's license unflagged, his access to firearms unrestricted. This sequence of procedural gaps formed the foundation of what would later become the core of the Attorney General's administrative review. Why a man actively named in a protective order, with a history of coercive behavior, faced no restriction on movement or weapon possession. Investigators traced back Gleason's digital footprint across the 2 months leading up to the murder. Using a combination of subpoenaed location data and phone records, authorities confirmed that his phone had pinged within 100 feet of Sandra's apartment building at least 8 times between May and June 15th. These visits occurred between the hours of 1 a.m. and 5 a.m., times that would not be explainable by any coincidental errands. In 3 of those instances, security footage from a nearby laundromat captured a silver pickup truck matching Gleason's vehicle idling along the curb. He never exited the vehicle. He never approached the apartment. But the pattern was consistent, and it fit the psychological profile of pre-incident stalking. Sandra had not reported those sightings to police. Her sister, Lucia, later told investigators, "She didn't want to make more noise. She thought staying quiet would make him go away." It didn't. Around June 1st, Gleason created a new email account under a pseudonym. The account was used only 3 times, all to view firearm sales listed on private classifieds based in Maine. Unlike New Hampshire, Maine had no requirement for background checks in private gun sales between individuals. On June 7, 2025, he drove to a rural town in Oxford County, Maine, to meet a seller. The transaction was not documented with any legal paperwork. The weapon purchased, a 12-gauge Remington 870, was consistent with the shell casings recovered at La Casita. The seller, interviewed days later, said Gleason seemed polite, maybe a little too calm, and said he wanted the shotgun for protection at a camp he was renovating. The seller did not request ID. The sale was legal under state law. To investigators, this was a turning point in the timeline. It marked the moment Gleason's behavior shifted from surveillance to procurement, and it added another layer of failure. Not personal, but systemic. The motive was becoming clearer. But what stood out most wasn't what Gleason did. It was how easily he did it. No legal block, no alert system, no mechanism that prevented a man named in a restraining order from crossing state lines and acquiring a weapon, then returning home without a trace. By June 20th, 3 days before Sandra's murder, Gleason had driven past her restaurant twice. License plate readers registered his vehicle in the vicinity at 6:13 a.m. and 7:42 p.m., each time passing by without stopping. The detail that most disturbed investigators came from Sandra's voicemail inbox. On June 21st, she received a message at 2:19 a.m. It lasted 11 seconds. No words were spoken, just silence. Then the click of a vehicle door, then nothing. She never responded. One analyst in the task force report later wrote, "Every layer of this case, digital, legal, physical, showed premeditation. The pattern wasn't missed, it was seen, it just wasn't stopped." This chapter of the investigation didn't produce a new suspect. It didn't uncover some hidden conspiracy or second narrative. What it did reveal was how predictable violence can be when all the warning signs are logged, but no one connects them before it's too late. Sandra Fuentes didn't die because no one saw this coming. She died because everyone saw pieces of it, and none of those pieces were enough to trigger action. By June 25, 2025, investigators from the New Hampshire State Police Firearms and Toolmark Unit had completed preliminary analysis on the weapon found at the scene. The shotgun was a Remington 870 Express 12-gauge pump action, recovered next to the male decedent inside the restroom of La Casita. It was loaded with Feber 100 buckshot shells, one spent casing found near the bar, the other in the restroom. Serial number 411X618 was partially etched, but still legible under microscopic lighting. The first priority was weapon trace. Through the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF e-trace system, technicians attempted to locate the original point of sale for that firearm. The trace returned to a licensed dealer in Lewiston, Maine, from a sale in 2019. The buyer at that time was a private collector who later reported selling it in a private transaction in early June 2025. That transaction had no paperwork, no background check, and no registration, fully legal under Maine's private party sales law. When contacted, the seller confirmed the exchange took place on June 7th at a roadside parking lot just outside Bethel, Maine. The buyer had paid in cash, no bill of sale, no questions asked. The seller described the man as quiet, polite, said he needed it for camp security. That man matched the DMV photo of Michael Gleason Jr. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station confirmed the meeting. From a forensic standpoint, the shotgun was operational, legally sold, but completely unmonitored, making it an ideal tool for someone seeking to bypass detection. That lack of oversight became central in internal reviews initiated later by the state's Office of Victim Advocacy. But at this point in the investigation, it represented a dangerous pattern. A man under a protective order had obtained a deadly weapon across state lines without triggering any law enforcement alert. Additional lab analysis focused on fingerprints and tool marks. Both the pump and trigger assembly bore full right thumb and left index ridge impressions, matching Gleason's postmortem prints. The pattern of ejection marks on the shells confirmed the weapon had been fired in 2 separate cycles. Analysts noted minor carbon fouling inside the barrel, consistent with recent cleaning, suggesting pre-use preparation. There were no signs of mechanical failure. Meanwhile, ballistics examiners conducted distance determination based on soot patterning and stippling documented during autopsy. The shot that struck Sandra Fuentes had been discharged at approximately 30-36 inches from her torso. No upward or downward angle. It was a level shot, fired at standing height. The wound profile aligned with immediate fatality. This allowed the team to confirm sequence. Sandra had been shot first, near the bar, mid-movement, before the shooter entered the restroom and discharged the second round. No signs of external struggle, no defensive wounds. The forensic sequencing showed intent, control, and finality. He had entered with a weapon, executed the first shot, then turned it on himself. No pauses, no pursuit. To solidify the timeline, digital forensic teams synchronized video footage with cell tower ping data. Gleason's phone had moved from Milan, NH, at approximately 8:10 a.m. on June 23rd, crossing Route 16. It pinged on the Berlin North Tower at 9:28 a.m. and remained within 100 meters of La Casita until 9:47 a.m., when the device disconnected from the network. That loss of signal matched exactly with the moment his body was found, with the phone in his pants pocket. Battery at 83%, powered on but damaged from the blast shockwave. It had not been powered off manually. It had been disabled by trauma. Combined with the surveillance timestamp, shotgun audio at 9:44:07 and 9:44:51, investigators finalized the event duration. Sandra Fuentes died less than 15 minutes after opening the restaurant. The next layer of detail came from trace evidence. A blue microfiber towel found in the restroom tested positive for oil and carbon residue. Analysts determined it had been used to clean the weapon barrel shortly before firing. That towel matched a set sold by Dollar General, confirmed to have been purchased at 8:43 a.m. that same morning in Berlin. Store surveillance showed Gleason at the register, alone. That receipt was found folded in his back pocket. The sequencing was now beyond doubt. The suspect had prepared the weapon, driven to Berlin with the clear purpose of using it, and executed a brief, tightly timed plan. There were no co-conspirators, no messages sent, no notes left behind. Yet, what startled the lead detective wasn't just the efficiency, it was the quiet of it all. No speeding, no confrontation, no contact with anyone else that day. He drove, entered, fired, and ended it. There was one final detail noted in the forensic log from the crime scene. Near the base of the restaurant's rear exit, officers found a paper bag containing latex gloves, a disposable poncho, and an empty water bottle. Items never used, likely backup or contingency prep. The gloves were clean, the poncho folded, the bottle dry. But their presence implied that the suspect had considered more complex scenarios, possibly cleanup or retreat. He had options. He made a choice. That choice was final. By the afternoon of June 26, 2025, investigators had completed their primary forensic walkthrough of Gleason's residence in Milan, New Hampshire. The structure was modest, an aging two-bedroom rental tucked behind a row of pine trees off Route 110. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle, and no presence of any other individuals. What investigators did find was what they had been waiting for: a window into intent. The discovery was made in the top drawer of a small writing desk, positioned near the back window facing a wooded clearing. Folded neatly between two outdated utility bills was a sheet of lined paper. No envelope, no address. Written in block letters and without a signature, the content read like a combination of explanation and justification. It wasn't long, just over 200 words, but it was enough. I gave everything. I was patient. I waited. She made me believe in something. Then she walked away like it was nothing. You don't get to do that and pretend it didn't happen. She made me invisible. The paper was dated June 21st, the same day Sandra received the silent voicemail. There were no fingerprints on the page itself. Analysts later confirmed it had been handled with gloves, matching residue found on a nitrile glove in a trash bin just outside the home. The decision to wear gloves while writing a letter no one would read confirmed what investigators already suspected. The writer was documenting a motive, not reaching for reconciliation. Next to the writing desk, officers found a small brown box containing several personal effects. Inside, a laminated photo of Sandra and Gleason from 2023, a flyer from her former food truck venture, and a printed copy of the restraining order filed against him. Each item was annotated in pen with phrases like liar, ungrateful, and after everything. This wasn't a man caught in a moment of emotional collapse. This was someone organizing a narrative, privately, methodically. The letter itself wasn't addressed to anyone. It didn't say her name, but everything in the room pointed to Sandra. This discovery shifted the tone of the investigation. Until then, most forensic work had focused on sequence, on weaponry, on movement. But the letter offered context, a distorted justification, a final mental posture. It clarified what law enforcement had already theorized. This was not a spontaneous act. It was a decision that had been shaped slowly, under a false sense of entitlement and grievance. From a behavioral analysis standpoint, the content matched patterns seen in pathological possessiveness. The language suggested a subject unable to separate identity from control. He didn't describe betrayal in legal terms. He described it as erasure, as if Sandra's withdrawal from his life was a form of public humiliation. The most telling phrase was short: "She made me invisible." Investigators interpreted this as a self-assigned victim role, common in cases where the aggressor externalizes blame while rationalizing retribution. This wasn't about a fight. It wasn't about closure. It was about the rejection of limits. When Sandra enforced boundaries, he saw them as offenses. When she sought help, he saw it as betrayal. When she disengaged, he saw it as erasure. There was no apology in the letter, no regret, only an insistence that he had been wronged and that his response was proportional. From a legal standpoint, the letter held no prosecutorial weight. There was no trial to prosecute. But from a forensic behavioral view, it became a critical artifact. It confirmed escalation. It aligned with the timeline. And it reinforced that Sandra's prior fears were grounded in reality, not speculation. The bag of personal items found in the same drawer was logged into evidence. Later, in a quiet meeting room at the Coos County Sheriff's Office, Sandra's sister was given the option to view the contents. She declined. She didn't want to see a version of her sister's life that had been reassembled by the man who took it from her. Instead, she made one request: that the letter never be released publicly in full. The investigators agreed. Sometimes what people write down in the dark shouldn't be given oxygen in the light. On June 27, 2025, a full digital cross-match was completed between Sandra Fuentes' mobile device, the restaurant's security footage, nearby cell towers, and third-party surveillance from adjacent businesses. The aim wasn't just to reconstruct the timeline. We already had that. The goal now was to capture the minutes before the first shot was fired. What exactly happened between 9:36 and 9:44 a.m. inside La Casita? The restaurant's internal surveillance provided partial visual confirmation. At 9:36:12 a.m., a man entered the front door. His head was down, face obscured by a baseball cap. The camera angle captured only his right profile. He moved directly past the counter without hesitation. No attempt at verbal interaction, no pause, just deliberate steps toward the service bar. Sandra appeared on camera less than 10 seconds later, emerging from the prep kitchen, holding a towel and setting it on the counter. There's no visible panic, no sign she recognized a threat. Investigators noted this detail carefully. It indicated that her attacker didn't enter with overt aggression or noise. He entered quietly. The kind of quiet that catches people off guard. Then came the gap. From 9:37 to 9:44 a.m., the camera in the dining area remained active, but recorded no major movement. Sandra remained behind the bar, partially obscured by a hanging spice rack. The man was out of frame, most likely behind the support column that led to the hallway. There was no struggle, no raised voice caught by ambient audio. That silence would matter. When audio was isolated using directional filtering, a faint metallic racking sound was captured at 9:43:56. Investigators later confirmed it was consistent with the chambering of a shotgun round. Less than 11 seconds later, the first shot rang out. Here's where the data closed the gap. Gleason's phone, which had been stationary since 9:30 a.m., showed a sudden drop in signal strength at exactly 9:44:08. It reconnected briefly at 9:44:41, likely due to movement between the bar and restroom. The second shot, heard at 9:44:51, was the final data point. When compared against geolocation logs from Sandra's phone, we see a chilling alignment. Her phone remained in the same position, immobile, GPS coordinates unchanged, until it was recovered by law enforcement. It had stopped updating location at the exact second the first shot was captured. She had no time to run, no time to call, nothing beyond that final still image of her, placing a towel on the counter. Investigators also reviewed camera feeds from two surrounding businesses, a corner pharmacy and a laundromat across the street. Both systems showed the same silver pickup truck parked in the alleyway behind La Casita at 9:32 a.m. It remained there until 10:05 untouched. Berlin PD later confirmed the vehicle had not been moved post-incident. Gleason had walked into the restaurant with everything already planned. He didn't intend to leave. But there was something else, something not visible on any video. At 9:34 a.m., Sandra's smartwatch recorded an elevated heart rate. The spike was small but sharp, jumping from 82 BPM to 128 in under 5 seconds. It held at that level for over 6 minutes before abruptly dropping. Analysts noted the trend could indicate a stress response, likely triggered by visual recognition. It meant Sandra may have seen Gleason arrive from a distance. She may have known what was coming before he ever opened the door. This kind of physiological data isn't common in criminal investigations, but it matters. Not as evidence, but as insight. It told a story her voice couldn't. She didn't react out loud. She didn't flee. But her body registered fear. That data point became a haunting addition to the case file. The final component of the digital reconstruction came from cross-matching Sandra's previous routes over the last 2 weeks using Google Maps location history, enabled by default on her phone. Investigators discovered she had taken alternate routes to work 3 times between June 12th and June 18th. Each time she bypassed Main Street entirely and cut through residential back roads. Those deviations weren't due to traffic. There had been no construction. It was intentional. She may have known she was being followed. She just couldn't prove it. The behavioral team reviewing the case would later write, "She did everything a person could do without direct evidence. She changed her patterns, secured her location, and minimized exposure. The system didn't meet her halfway." What this chapter revealed wasn't just about when it happened. It was about how little space Sandra had between recognition and consequence. 8 minutes. That's how long he was inside the restaurant before the first shot. 8 minutes in which nothing looked out of place, but everything had already been decided. By the end of June 2025, the homicide of Sandra Marisol Fuentes Huaracha had transitioned from an isolated criminal event to a case study under administrative scrutiny. Internally, law enforcement agencies in New Hampshire had begun compiling data not just on what happened inside La Casita on June 23rd, but what had not happened in the months leading up to it. The Coast County Sheriff's Office conducted a full review of Sandra's prior calls for help. According to dispatch logs, she had made 2 non-emergency reports in March 2025. One of them was categorized under suspicious vehicle loitering. In both instances, she declined to name a suspect. No report was filed. No officer followed up. That alone wasn't unusual. In rural jurisdictions, non-specific calls without physical evidence rarely escalate into full investigations. But in hindsight, both calls were made late at night, both while Sandra was home alone. On April 17th, Sandra appeared before a judge to file for a protective order. Her affidavit was coherent, detailed, and supported by electronic communications, including texts and voicemails. The court granted the restraining order and set a hearing for April 19th to review the accompanying misdemeanor complaint for unlawful confinement and theft. That's where the oversight began to widen. At the April 19th hearing, the defendant, Michael Gleason, appeared with legal counsel. He denied the allegations and requested the charges be dropped. The court declined but agreed to release him on $5,000 personal recognizance bail. There was no mandatory GPS monitoring, no follow-up inquiry about firearms access. The judge marked the case for continuance pending further evidence. This procedural outcome, legal on paper, became the critical failure point, because at that moment, the system had in hand a formal protective order, a pending criminal case involving coercive behavior, and a named subject known to live within 5 miles of the victim. Despite this, no law enforcement body flagged Gleason for weapons risk. No agency notified neighboring jurisdictions or entered the court status into any regional threat monitoring platform. Sandra remained unaware that he was free to travel, unrestricted. She believed the order had boundaries. In practice, it didn't. The lack of GPS monitoring was not a mistake. Under New Hampshire law, GPS conditions are discretionary unless the defendant is facing felony-level domestic charges or repeated protection order violations. Gleason met neither criteria yet. 2 weeks later, he was tracked near Sandra's apartment on 3 separate nights. Each time, law enforcement systems failed to flag him as being within prohibited proximity. Why? Because no system was in place to monitor it. In an internal memo dated July 1, 2025, the New Hampshire Department of Justice issued a statement acknowledging that current protective order enforcement mechanisms do not guarantee spatial compliance without active monitoring. The phrase was bureaucratically correct and devastating in implication. The same memo confirmed that Gleason had never been queried through the state's Domestic Violence Risk Indicator System, DVRIS, which, while not mandatory, could have elevated his case for behavioral review. At the federal level, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was briefed on the case. They noted that Gleason's behavioral markers, including escalating contact, perceived rejection, and acquisition of a weapon, matched prior case profiles where intimate partner violence transitioned to lethal outcomes. But their involvement came post-mortem. The risk pattern was visible, just not acted upon. This wasn't about lack of evidence. This was about lack of escalation protocol. Every piece was there. No one was empowered to act on it. What made this particularly stark for investigators was how ordinary the path had been. Sandra had done what victims are told to do: report, document, seek court protection. But the tools designed to protect her had thresholds too high to activate until after the damage was done. One of the internal reviewers put it plainly: "We had eyes on the behavior. We just didn't have the levers to slow it down." In late June, the New Hampshire Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence called for emergency hearings to review GPS compliance laws and bail criteria for misdemeanor-level domestic offenders. The proposal: automatic GPS monitoring for any subject named in a protection order who resides within a 15-mile radius of the petitioner. It wasn't just about Sandra. It was about the gap she exposed, because her case wasn't the first, and wouldn't be the last, where procedural limits became opportunities for tragedy. By the morning of June 24, 2025, Berlin, New Hampshire, had become more than a dot on the map. It was now a crime scene etched into the state's record of system failures. The death of Sandra Marisol Fuentes Huaracha and Michael Gleason Jr. had concluded in a murder-suicide that left no courtroom drama, no televised trial. Yet what remained demanded scrutiny, not just of a man, but of an infrastructure that watched, waited, and did nothing. The New Hampshire Department of Justice launched an internal review within 72 hours of the incident. Their task was surgical: identify every procedural step leading up to the shooting and determine where intervention had been not only possible, but mandated. It didn't take long to find fault lines. Gleason had been released on personal recognizance despite a violent restraining order violation. No GPS tracking had been implemented. The bail recommendation, based on a formula designed to reduce pretrial incarceration, hadn't been adjusted for the severity of the threat. Algorithms had overridden instinct. Policy had triumphed over pattern recognition. In parallel, the New Hampshire Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence issued a statement that did not mince words. The system did not fail Sandra Fuentes in a vacuum. It failed her in public. Advocacy groups began compiling legislative recommendations, including mandatory GPS monitoring in domestic violence cases with firearm threats, an automatic risk review when firearms are legally purchased by defendants under restraining orders, and judicial discretion override protocols in small-town bail decisions. These were not suggestions. They were demands issued in the name of a woman who had done everything the law had asked of her. Meanwhile, Berlin's town council quietly approved a citywide memorial in the form of a scholarship fund in Sandra's name, aimed at supporting first-generation college students from immigrant backgrounds. Her life had not been reducible to victimhood. She had been a daughter, a hard worker, a friend, a community voice. And though she never reached her 26th birthday, her name would fund opportunities that policies had denied her. The policy changes came slowly, as they always do. In late July 2025, Senate Bill 904 was introduced at the state level, proposing GPS monitoring be mandatory, not optional, in cases involving prior threats and firearm access. By September, public hearings were underway, dominated not by lawmakers, but by survivors, advocates, and law enforcement officials who admitted, on record, that their hands had been tied under the existing guidelines. The law had spoken softly when it needed to raise its voice. What distinguished this case wasn't its brutality. Unfortunately, domestic violence homicides involving prior warnings are not uncommon. What made Sandra's case a flashpoint was the paper trail, the visibility of each ignored step, the unmistakable clarity of the threat she documented. Her death wasn't only avoidable, it was statistically predictable. There is a line in the DOJ's final statement that reads more like a eulogy than a policy note. No statute or algorithm can replace judgment, and no reform will matter if warnings go unheeded. That line, buried near the end, encapsulated what every citizen of Berlin already understood. The cost of inaction isn't just bureaucratic, it's human. As for the public, many quietly processed what had happened. Some asked why it took death to spark change. Others simply showed up, at vigils, at hearings, at the restaurant Sandra once managed. In small towns, justice doesn't arrive in grand gestures. It echoes in how people remember you when the news cycle fades. Sandra Fuentes didn't leave behind a legal battle or a viral video. What she left was evidence of a system designed to protect her that didn't, of a man flagged repeatedly who still bought a gun, of a town now forced to confront how close negligence sits to violence. The final truth is simple. You cannot reverse silence. You can only replace it with accountability. And when the system gets another warning, another Sandra, it will no longer have the excuse of ignorance. If there's one thing I've learned from sharing Sandra's story, it's this. Doing everything by the book doesn't always protect you, but it should. No one should have to beg the system to listen when the signs are clear. As someone who's walked through the timelines, the warnings, and the aftermath, I hope this reminds you to speak up, stay alert, and never underestimate the power of documentation. Sometimes the only thing standing between justice and tragedy is whether people choose to act. What do you think this case says about our justice system? Do you believe change is really possible? Or are we just waiting for the next name to make headlines? If this story moved you or made you think, leave a comment with your thoughts, or just tell me where you're watching from. If it didn't resonate, tell me why. I welcome your voice either way, and if you'd like to hear more stories like this, Don't forget to subscribe to the channel.